catching blowies from
Hello
man days.
everyone,
I was catching
welcome to my
blowies
channel.
on the boat. On the boat.
I am Avery Vance, 28 years old, and from my high-rise office in San Francisco, I oversee millions of dollars in tech investments, though my family in Ohio still views me as their greatest disappointment. The ultimate insult arrived via a family group chat when my mother Martha sent a message that changed everything. Avery, don't come to tomorrow night's BBQ. Your sister Chloe's boyfriend is a New York billionaire, and this family doesn't want to lose face by having you there looking so ordinary. My father immediately chimed in to say my presence would only remind everyone of our family's mediocrity. I stared at the screen and replied with 2 words, "Got it." They were excluding me to protect a lie, completely unaware that my personal bank account could buy their entire neighborhood. But the real explosion happened exactly 5 months later. After months of listening to their bragging about Chloe's royal lifestyle and her billionaire catch, I finally agreed to bring my boyfriend home to meet the family. The moment we stepped across the threshold and my boyfriend's father walked into the living room, the atmosphere turned radioactive. My mother and Chloe didn't just gasp, they screamed at the top of their lungs, their faces contorted in a mixture of pure terror and utter humiliation as they locked eyes with the man I had brought home. Before we get into the chilling details of why that scream changed our lives forever, let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you love seeing toxic family members get exactly what they deserve, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel right now, and drop a comment below to show your support. The roots of my family's betrayal were not planted overnight, but were nurtured through 2 decades of systematic favoritism that defined my childhood in Ohio. While Chloe was celebrated as the golden child, whose every whim was a command, I was treated as an inconvenient afterthought whose primary purpose was to remain out of sight. My parents, Martha and Robert, operated on the misguided belief that Chloe's beauty was a family asset that required constant investment, while my intelligence was merely a tool to be exploited. I vividly remember the winter of my junior year in high school, when the heating bill in our modest house skyrocketed, and Robert told me that I would have to skip my SAT prep classes so they could afford the custom-made gown Chloe wanted for a local beauty pageant. He didn't see it as a sacrifice of my future. He saw it as a necessary contribution to the only daughter he believed had a chance at real success. Martha was even more blunt, often telling me that a girl with my plain features needed to work twice as hard just to be noticed, whereas Chloe only had to walk into a room to be adored. When I finally received my acceptance letter to a prestigious university in California, with a partial scholarship, there were no celebrations or proud phone calls to relatives. Instead, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and asked if I could decline the offer and attend a local community college so they could use my college fund to pay for Chloe's luxury apartment in Cincinnati. They argued that Chloe needed the right environment to attract the kind of high society men who could elevate the family, while I was sturdy enough to make it on my own without any help. That was the day I realized that to them I wasn't a daughter. I was a backup plan, a safety net they intended to use until it frayed. I refused their request, packed my life into 2 weathered suitcases, and left for San Francisco without a single dollar from their bank account. For the next 6 years, the silence from Ohio was only broken when they needed something: a small loan for Chloe's car payment or a favor to cover Martha's mounting credit card debt. They never asked about my career, never wondered how I was paying for my master's degree, and certainly never imagined that I was rising through the ranks of the venture capital world. They preferred to believe the narrative that I was a low-level office assistant struggling to make rent in an expensive city, because that version of me didn't threaten Chloe's self-imposed crown. I accepted this role playing the part of the struggling daughter during our rare, awkward phone calls because it kept their greed at a distance. I watched from afar as they liquidated Robert's modest retirement fund to keep up the appearance of Chloe's influencer lifestyle, a house of cards built on the hope that she would one day marry a man with enough money to bail them all out. By the time Chloe announced she was dating a billionaire from New York, the arrogance in my family home reached a fever pitch. They acted as though they had already won the lottery, treating me with even more disdain than usual. The text message telling me to stay away from the BBQ wasn't just a rejection. It was their way of declaring that they no longer needed their safety net because the big fish had finally bitten the hook. I spent that weekend working in my office watching the fog roll over the Bay Bridge, feeling a strange sense of liberation. The ties that had bound me to their toxicity were finally being cut by their own hands. I wasn't the one losing face. They were the ones losing the only person who actually cared about their well-being, though they were too blinded by the prospect of billionaire gold to realize it. In the high-octane environment of San Francisco's financial district, the name Avery Vance commanded respect that my parents could never comprehend. I had spent years building a reputation as a shrewd investor who could spot a unicorn startup before it even had a prototype, and my personal wealth reflected my success. I lived in a sprawling penthouse with views that stretched to the horizon, a space filled with quiet luxury, and a collection of modern art that cost more than the Ohio house I grew up in. However, my personal life remained intentionally simple, a sanctuary away from the predatory world of high finance. It was this desire for authenticity that led me to Julian Montgomery. We met at a volunteer event for urban redevelopment, and I was immediately drawn to his quiet intensity and the way he spoke about architecture as a form of social service. Julian told me he was an architect working for a mid-sized firm, and for the first months of our relationship, we lived a life that was blissfully ordinary. We spent our Saturday mornings at farmers markets and our evenings exploring hidden dive bars in the Mission District. I loved that Julian didn't care about my title or my portfolio. He loved me for my mind and my quick wit. I kept my true financial status hidden from him, not out of a lack of trust, but because I wanted to be sure that what we had was real. Ironically, Julian was doing the exact same thing. He never mentioned his family's wealth, often opting to split the bill at modest restaurants and driving a 10-year-old sedan that he maintained himself. He spoke about his father Arthur with a mix of affection and frustration, describing him as a man who had lost his way in the pursuit of social status. Julian's mother Eleanor was the one he truly admired, calling her the iron backbone of their family, though he mentioned she was currently in Europe managing a massive corporate merger for her global steel empire. I appreciated his independence, seeing in him a kindred spirit who had also fought to define himself outside of his parents' expectations. As our relationship deepened, I began to see a future with Julian that I had never dared to imagine. He made me feel seen in a way that my parents never had, and for the first time the shadows of my childhood began to recede. But as our engagement approached, the reality of our two worlds colliding became unavoidable. Julian wanted me to meet his father, and he was equally eager to meet the family I had spoken so little about. I tried to warn him, explaining that my parents were obsessed with wealth and that my sister was currently involved with a man they claimed was a billionaire. Julian laughed it off, saying that his father was also a bit of a social climber and that he was used to dealing with people who equated worth with a bank balance. He had no idea that my family had already written me off as a failure, or that they were currently worshipping a man they had never even seen in person. I realized then that the only way to move forward was to let the two worlds crash into each other. I would take Julian back to Ohio, but I would do it on my terms. I would give my family the struggling daughter they expected, and I would let them see the ordinary man I had chosen. I wanted to see if they could show a single shred of humanity when faced with their daughter's happiness, or if they were truly as far gone as I suspected. Julian believed we were going on a simple trip to seek a blessing, but I knew I was walking into a trap of my own, making one designed to finally expose the truth. The weekend of the forbidden BBQ was a masterclass in performative vanity, captured in agonizing detail through Chloe's social media feed. I spent that Saturday evening in my San Francisco penthouse Luat Qua, a relentless stream of photos and videos that Martha and Chloe were posting to ensure the world knew they had finally arrived. Every image was carefully staged to project an image of extreme wealth, featuring catered platters of lobster tails, bottles of champagne that cost $500 each, and a backyard that had been transformed into a mini resort. Chloe was the star of every shot, draped in designer silk and wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that she claimed was a just because gift from her billionaire beau. But the man himself remained a phantom, a carefully cropped arm in an expensive suit, or a silhouette standing by the grill. Chloe was playing the mystery card, perfectly telling her followers that her king valued his privacy and that his family's dynasty was too prestigious for common social media exposure. I zoomed in on one particular photo of the man's hand holding a glass of vintage scotch. On his pinky finger was a signet ring with a unique crest, a shield, and a falcon that I recognized from a high society gala I had attended in New York. My heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fit together. That crest belonged to the Montgomery family, but it wasn't the branch of the family that actually held the power. It was the mark of the socialites who lived on the periphery of the real fortune. I watched a short video clip where the man's voice was heard bragging to my father about his private island in the Caribbean and his plans to buy a professional sports team. My father, Robert, was practically groveling in the background, nodding at every word as if he were receiving a sermon from a god. It was pathetic to watch. These were the people who had told me I was ordinary, yet they were being hoodwinked by a man whose stories were so grandiose they were bordering on farcical. I noticed Martha in the corner of one video wearing a new fur stole in the middle of a humid Ohio summer, looking like a caricature of a wealthy matriarch. They were spending money they didn't have, likely on credit, convinced that their new benefactor would eventually settle all their debts. The irony was almost too much to bear. My parents were excluding their own daughter, a woman who actually managed real billions, to Nige Bo, a man who was likely using them as much as they were trying to use him. I recognized the man's silver hair and the specific way he held his chin from a photograph Julian had once shown me of his father, Arthur. If this was indeed Arthur Montgomery, then my family wasn't just being lied to, they were being used as pawns in a very dangerous game. Arthur was a known Chan Vuong in the New York circles, a man who lived a life of luxury entirely funded by his wife, Eleanor's steel fortune. He had no billions of his own, only a generous allowance and a desperate need to feel like the powerful man he pretended to be. By playing the billionaire in a small town like our suburb in Ohio, he was getting the ego boost he couldn't get in Manhattan. My sister wasn't dating a tycoon. She was dating a trophy husband on a midlife crisis bender. I closed my phone, the glowing screen, the only light in my dark living room. I didn't feel the need to call them and warn them. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have just accused me of being jealous. I realized that the only way for them to learn was to let the fire I saw starting in that backyard burn until there was nothing left but ash. 5 months had passed since the BBQ, and the legend of Chloe's billionaire boyfriend had grown to mythic proportions in my family's eyes. According to Martha's increasingly frequent and boastful emails, they were already looking at wedding venues in the Hamptons and discussing pre-nuptial agreements that would set the whole family up for life. It was during this peak of their delusion that I decided to strike. Julian had officially proposed, and the time for our families to meet had arrived. I sat in my office, the San Francisco skyline shimmering behind me, and dialed my mother's number. I kept my voice soft-laced with a rehearsed tremor that made me sound like the broken, struggling daughter they wanted me to be. When Martha answered, her voice was cold and hurried, as if speaking to me was a chore that was beneath her new social standing. I told her that I was engaged to a man named Julian, a simple architect, who worked very hard but didn't have much to his name. I began to vouch in, begging her to let us come home for a weekend so Julian could meet them. I told her that I felt lost without my family's guidance, and that I wanted my parents' blessing more than anything in the world. I could hear the smirk in Martha's voice through the phone. She laughed a sharp, mocking sound and told me that she would have to ask Chloe if there was even room for us at the house, given that Arthur was often there, and they didn't want to clutter the place up with people who didn't fit the vibe. I continued my act, crying softly and promising that Julian and I would stay out of the way, that we would even stay at a budget motel nearby if it made things easier. This appeal to her superiority worked like a charm. Martha finally agreed, telling me that it might be a good reality check for me to see the kind of life Chloe was living so I could understand why they had been so hard on me. She said they would host a small brunch on Sunday, but warned me to make sure Julian dressed decently so as not to offend Arthur's refined tastes. I thanked her profusely, acting as if she had just granted me a royal pardon. After I hung up, Julian looked at me with a mixture of horror and confusion. He asked why I had debased myself like that, why I had lied about our success and our lives. I took his hands in mine and explained the logic of the trap. My family only respected power, but they only felt safe around weakness. By appearing as a failure, I was inviting them to show their true ugly selves without the filter of greed or fear. I wanted Julian to see the people who had raised me, and I wanted them to realize that the ordinary man they were prepared to mock was the only person in the room with real integrity and real connections. Julian was hesitant, but he trusted me. He mentioned that his father Arthur had been spending a lot of time traveling for business lately, and that he was actually looking forward to a trip to Ohio to clear his head. Julian had no idea that his father was the very billionaire my family was worshipping. I booked our flights in coach, making sure to send the confirmation to Martha as proof of our struggling status, while secretly arranging for a luxury car service to pick us up from the airport. I spent the week preparing for the confrontation not with anger, but with a cold, clinical precision. I was going home not to reconcile, but to witness the final collapse of a system of lies that had governed my life for too long. My parents thought they were preparing to humble me. They had no idea they were actually preparing their own funeral. The flight to Ohio was an exercise in suppressed adrenaline. Julian sat next to me reading a book on sustainable design, completely unaware that he was about to become the centerpiece of a family scandal that would rival a Shakespearean tragedy. He mentioned casually that his mother Eleanor had called him from Zurich to complain about Arthur's mysterious disappearance from New York. Apparently, Arthur had told her he was attending a meditation retreat in the Midwest to deal with the stress of his non-existent business ventures. I listened to Julian, my heart thumping a steady rhythm of anticipation. The level of Arthur's deception was staggering. He was using my family's home as a hideout from his real life, playing the role of a titan among people who didn't know any better. As we landed and picked up our modest rental car, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was no longer the scared 10-year-old girl who had to hide her report cards to avoid Chloe's jealousy. I was a woman who had built her own empire, and I was walking back into the lion's den with a lion of my own. When we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, the scene was exactly as I had pictured it. There were several luxury cars parked on the lawn, all of them likely rentals or leased under Arthur's wife's corporate accounts. The house itself looked like a cheap imitation of a mansion with gaudy outdoor decorations that screamed new money, despite the fact that there was no real money behind them. Martha met us at the door wearing an outfit that was far too formal for a family brunch and enough gold jewelry to sink a ship. She didn't hug me, she just looked Julian up and down with a sneer of disappointment, noting his simple jeans and button-down shirt. "I suppose he's clean," she whispered to me as she ushered us inside. Robert was in the living room standing by a table filled with expensive catering, looking like a man who had finally found the social standing he had always craved. He didn't even acknowledge Julian at first, instead choosing to brag about the investment opportunities Arthur had been sharing with him. Chloe was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear her laughter echoing from the backyard. Martha told us to keep our voices down and to not speak unless spoken to when Arthur came into the room. She explained that a man of his stature wasn't used to the chatter of the lower classes. Julian's brow furrowed in confusion, but he remained polite, his hand resting supportively on the small of my back. I could feel the tension in the room building like a physical weight. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and desperation. Julian leaned in and whispered that the house felt vibeless and performative, and I couldn't help but smile. He was seeing it already. Martha then announced that Arthur and Chloe were finishing a private business call in the study and would be out shortly. She spent the next 10 minutes lecturing me on how I should try to learn something from Chloe's success, and how it was a shame I had settled for so little. I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the study door. I knew that in a few moments the man who was currently being treated as a king would walk through that door and see his own son standing in the middle of his lie. I could almost hear the ticking of a clock counting down to the second when the billionaire myth would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Julian took a sip of the cheap orange juice Martha had poured for him, his face a mask of calm, while I prepared myself for the scream I knew was coming. The study door finally opened, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from stagnant to electric. Chloe stepped out first, looking radiant in a designer dress that I recognized as part of a collection my firm had recently invested in. She was clinging to the arm of a man with silver hair and an aura of bored arrogance. "Everyone, Arthur is here," Chloe announced, her voice dripping with a triumph that she intended to use as a weapon against me. But the man at her side didn't look triumphant. The moment his eyes landed on Julian, the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. Julian froze his glass of juice halfway to his mouth. "Dad?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow all the air in the room. Then the explosion happened. Martha and Chloe didn't just gasp, they screamed. It was a high-pitched guttural sound of pure terror and confusion that seemed to echo off the walls. "Dad, what do you mean, Dad?" Chloe shrieked, her hand flying to her throat as she stepped away from Arthur as if he were suddenly radioactive. Arthur tried to turn and run back into the study, but Julian was faster. He stepped forward, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Arthur Montgomery, what the hell are you doing here in Ohio?" Julian demanded. "And why is this woman wearing my mother's diamond necklace?" The room erupted into chaos. Martha was clutching her chest, looking between Julian and Arthur with wild, uncomprehending eyes. "Julian, you're his son, but that means you're a Montgomery." Robert was backing away, his face a distorted mask of panic. "He said he was a billionaire. He said he was going to invest in my firm. He said he was a bachelor." Julian laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that cut through the room like a blade. "He's a bachelor. He's been married to my mother Eleanor for 30 years, and he's not a billionaire. He's a kept man who lives on a monthly allowance because he's too incompetent to run a lemonade stand, let alone a global empire." Chloe turned on Arthur, her face red with rage. "You told me you were the CEO. You told me you were worth $5 billion. Arthur finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic whimpering thing. "Chloe, please. I can explain. I just wanted to feel important. I wanted to be with someone who didn't know the real me." Julian stepped between them, his eyes fixed on the necklace around Chloe's neck. "That necklace was reported stolen from our safe in New York 3 weeks ago. My mother has been frantic looking for it." "You didn't just lie, Arthur. You're a thief." Chloe tried to cover the jewelry with her hands, sobbing hysterically. "It's mine, he gave it to me. You can't take it." Martha rushed toward me, her face a mask of desperate realization. Avery, you knew. You knew Julian was a real billionaire. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were a failure?" I looked her in the eyes, my expression cold and unmoved. "Because I wanted to see if you loved me for who I was, or if you only loved the money, and you proved exactly what I suspected. You chose a fake billionaire over your own daughter, and now you have to deal with the consequences." The room was a battlefield of broken dreams and exposed lies. Arthur was pleading with Julian not to call Eleanor while Robert was trying to calculate how much debt he had just incurred to impress a man who didn't have a penny to his name. I stood in the center of it all, feeling a profound sense of peace. The scream had been the sound of their world ending and mine finally beginning. The aftermath of the confrontation at the brunch was as swift and brutal as the American legal system allows when a woman of Eleanor Montgomery's power is involved. Julian called his mother before we even left the driveway, and by the time we were back in San Francisco, the billionaire dream of the Vance family had turned into a living nightmare. Eleanor Montgomery did not hesitate. She filed for divorce the next morning, citing grand larceny and fraud, and she used her considerable resources to ensure that Arthur was left with absolutely nothing. She froze every account he had access to, canceled his corporate credit cards, and had him served with a lawsuit for the return of the stolen jewelry. But her fury didn't stop at Arthur. Her legal team turned their sights on my parents and Chloe, filing a civil suit for the recovery of the funds Arthur had misappropriated to fund their lifestyle. Because the money had been taken from Montgomery corporate accounts, it was a federal matter. My parents were forced to sell the house, the very house I had secretly been subsidizing, to pay for the legal defense they couldn't afford. Chloe's influencer life evaporated instantly. The brands she had lied to and the followers she had deceived turned on her with a vengeance. She went from posing on private jets to working a minimum wage job at a discount clothing store just to stay afloat. Martha and Robert tried to call me hundreds of times, their messages shifting from angry demands to pathetic, tearful pleas for me to save the family. They even tried to show up at my office in San Francisco, but my security team had been briefed, and they were escorted from the building without ever seeing my face. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. In the United States, when you build a life on the exploitation of others and the worship of false idols, the fall is always long and hard. I didn't give them a single cent, and I never will. They had their chance to be a family, and they traded it for a mirage. Julian and I were married 6 months later in a small, elegant ceremony on the coast of Maine. Eleanor was there, and she became a close friend and mentor to me, respecting the empire I had built on my own. As I stood at the altar looking into Julian's eyes, I realized that the greatest value of my journey wasn't the money or the revenge. It was the freedom that comes from knowing exactly who you are. To the audience watching this, let my story be a lesson. Your value is not determined by the labels your family puts on you, and real wealth isn't found in a bank account. It's found in the integrity of your character. My family lost everything because they were chasing a shadow, while I gained everything because I was willing to walk through the fire to find the truth. I am Avery Vance, and I am no longer the girl they tried to hide. I am the woman who stood her ground, and I have never been more at peace. This story highlights a profound truth. Those who seek to climb the social ladder by stepping on their own family will eventually find themselves with no ground to stand on. Avery's refusal to reconcile is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary boundary to protect the life she worked so hard to build. True family is earned, not inherited.